Hello to my audience, friends, and family. It's Sunny Sharma with India Insight with Sunny Sharma. Oh, I almost got that wrong. Today is Black History Month in February. For Black History Month, I want to do something special. I'm going to share six podcasts on all about a book called "Let Nobody Turn Us Around," an African American anthology. In these six podcasts, I'll be detailing six eras since the founding of the American Republic around 1768, detailing prominent black intellectuals and black figures and their political and social intellectual thought that has contributed to the black struggle for liberation. So first, just to preview the first introduction to these six podcasts. Here are some of the figures that will be detailed in the podcast. What we have here, the book ends with the election of Barack Obama to the presidency, just to highlight how far the Black struggle for liberation has gone. And the book begins with one of the first Black authors and publishers in America, a poet and author named Phyllis Wheatley. Right here, she lived from 1753 to 1784. Some other people who I'll mention in this introduction include figures who are critical of the prison system in America, such as Dr. Angela Davis and Dr. Michelle Alexander. Many other prominent abolitionists or resistors to slavery, such as Nat Turner. The most prominent abolitionist of the abolitionist period, Frederick Douglass. Figures such as Ida B. Wells, who was a prominent newspaper writer who highlighted many of the lynchings that were happening in the early 1900s and late 1800s. Some other figures who I'll mention casually during this introduction include such prominent figures as Malcolm X, Dr. King, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the greatest intellectuals, perhaps the greatest Black intellectual. One of the most prominent Black feminists and Black intellectuals, female intellectuals, Dr. Bell Hooks, as well as some of the female leaders of the Black struggle, particularly of the civil rights period, including Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Other abolitionists such as Hubert Henry Harrison, other civil rights leaders who were very prominent, especially at a very young age, such as John Lewis, who also reached public office, who reached a political office after his fight for civil rights. He became a representative in Georgia. Also, the mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young, who also was a civil rights leader. Coretta Scott King, who was a prominent figure who really followed the legacy of her husband, Dr. King, who expanded the notion of civil rights to human rights on the global stage, even spoke to the United Nations. Nelson Mandela, I won't be talking very much about him because he's not an American Black figure, but he will be mentioned as someone who was very pivotal in the Black struggle, probably one of the most pivotal figures of the modern era. And lastly, I'll be mentioning, maybe not going very into depth with some of the American Rainbow Coalition figures, including Fred Hampton, who is very synonymous with the Rainbow Coalition, the first Black mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who ran for president in the 1980s. And of course, the 44th president of the United States, Barack Obama, who the book ends with. You know, the book starts with Phyllis Wheatley, and it ends with Barack Obama, who really is the fulfillment of the Black struggle for equality, for liberty, equality, justice, fairness, and fraternity. And now to go a little bit into the introduction, this is season 8, episode 5. If you enjoyed this podcast, this video podcast, please follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. So, in honor of Black History Month in February, a history that really should be celebrated more often, I want to introduce the trajectory of Black intellectual thought since the founding of the United States of America, all the way up to the seminal election of Barack Obama in 2008, as seen through the book Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American Anthology. This book is a collection of speeches and essays reflecting African American creative, social, and political thought in the struggle for freedom since 1768, which is around the founding of the American Republic, which was founded in 1776. I read parts of this book in my senior year class called Black Intellectual History in my second semester of 2021 at my alma mater, Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia, but didn't get to finish the entirety of this book until years later. The book, in detailing a multiplicity of Black perspectives, insists that the Black female contribution to the advancement of Black liberation throughout the modern era is severely understated and must be re-examined to understand the importance of their place in cooperation with other groups, especially their support of Black men who have typically taken leadership positions. What we see today as a product of our past struggle for fairness, rights, justice, and equality is a rise in both female leadership as well as Black female leaders in politics and other realms. The author's decision to begin the anthology with the Black woman Phyllis Wheatley in 1768 speaks just how far back the contribution of not just Black luminaries goes, but also shows just how profound is the intellectual and creative tradition of Black females throughout history. More importantly, the book traces the multiplicity of Black intellectual thought throughout 5 pivotal periods in American history since 1768. I'll be making 5 podcasts on these 5 periods to highlight some of the most critical insights of these eras, which eventually gave rise to a Black bourgeoisie in the 1980s and a system of mass incarceration and control of primarily Black and brown people, known as the New Jim Crow, which has only grown worse as time has gone by. So, Dr. Angela Davis and her protege, Dr. Michelle Alexander, both speak to the drastic need to reform our justice system or relegate society to the ultimatum of abolishing prisons once and for all. In the totality of the anthology, many of the perspectives complement one another. Many of them do not. What is starkly evident and emblematic of the Black tradition is a prevalent theme of advancing the cause of social justice, not just for themselves, but for all people. In many cases, Black dissenters, political leaders, whistleblowers, advocates, and intellectuals were the moral and social conscience of America, whether that was in early periods of abolition and slavery with such figures as Nat Turner and Frederick Douglass, all the way up to the New Left movement that boasted ideologues like Malcolm X, Dr. King, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Dr. Bell Hooks. Before we delve more into some of the fundamental writings and speeches of Black political, social, and cultural thought since 1768 to 2008, let's look a little bit into some of the foundational insights of the anthology Let Nobody Turn Us Around in the preface to the first edition, preface to the second edition, and the introduction of the anthology. It is no stretch of the imagination to say that most Black slaves did not have the agency to shape their own future or narrative for most of the 19th century and before. The struggle for Black liberation was characterized by a fight to dissent, and in doing so, with a concerted effort to politicize the experience of one's group and advance the cause of social justice. The author explains that politics begins at the moment when any group recognizes for itself its specific objective, interests, and aspirations and seeks agency to realize those interests. Such efforts drew substantial momentum after the Civil War, which ended in 1865 with the founding of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which abolished slavery, gave equal protection under the law to all American citizens, and gave Black adult males the right to vote. Finally, there were Black representatives in America, even if when looking in hindsight, there still were political efforts to resolve the fundamental grievances of Black people before the Civil War, primarily through the abolition movement. However, with every step forward, there's intense opposition to pull us back, even today. Immense strides, especially through social and political movements led by Black people, have been made to make America a more egalitarian society, but simultaneously, African Americans have experienced new forms of bound labor, massive incarceration, and deepening class stratification in the modern era. Has increased diversity in America and the growth of a Black bourgeoisie affected all people equally today? Certainly not, as seen through the explosive growth of private for-profit prisons since the 1980s, as seen through the corporate backlash against the push for more rights in the New Left movement of the 1950s and onward. Nonetheless, the author highlights that in many of these grassroots movements, women not only constitute the great majority of the cadre, but are also the leaders and theoreticians, such as civil rights figures including Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, and Fannie Lou Hamer. It follows then that even in the past, women were instrumental to Black political movements, both behind the scenes as well as leading from the front to highlight the evils of systemic discrimination while also speaking to the broader issues of inequality, such as the whistleblower and writer Ida B. Wells, who communicated the wide-scale oppression that Blacks faced as seen through the systemic lynchings of Blacks all across America in the early 1900s and late 1800s. It must be made apparent that the Black struggle is not just a triumph of the human spirit and a call for justice in a wasteland of oppression. It was also achieved by the efforts of ordinary people. The Black struggle for liberation was not just a battle against the evils of institutional racism that left them powerless. It was also a search for meaning and voice. This led to both political advocacy as well as cultural transformation, as seen through the creative endeavors in music and the arts, some of which are reflective of their experience in America. The authors of the book, Dr. Manning Marable and Dr. Leith Mullings, insist broadly that the themes of reform, resistance, and renewal form the cultural and social matrix of Black consciousness, community, and public discourse. Yet what we see as expressed through Black intellectual thought is a variety of perspectives which especially wavered between integrationist leanings and more nationalistic sentiment. The authors highlight that in periods of political optimism, which when the bar of institutional racism seemed to be in retreat, the integrationist perspective was usually dominant. But in times of white reaction or entrenchment from racial justice, such as the 1850s, 1920s, late 1960s, and early 1970s, Black nationalism resurfaced. Thus, throughout American history, Black people took the agency to respond to the currents of white animosity on the one hand, and the prospect of brotherhood, also called fraternity, on the other, as espoused by such figures as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in relation to what position they held based on Black assimilation in the broader American culture. Furthermore, the authors contend that the social visions, integration, nationalism, and transformation are not mutually exclusive, but are in fact broad overlapping traditions. Many Black luminaries transformed or shifted their intellectual paradigm as their outlooks changed, whether that was Hubert Henry Harrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. King, Malcolm X, but these were not the only transformations taking place. Seeking economic transformation, many Blacks chose a socialist outlook as reflected through one such Black intellectual who, in 1912, Hubert Henry Harrison, declared that socialism stands for the emancipation of the wage slaves. Many Black intellectuals seeing the exploitation and limitations of capitalism followed suit, such as Dr. King, who later in his life was a self-described democratic socialist. The more conservative Black political organizations sought full equality and integration, while those seeking more radical and immediate changes demanded revolutionary action. The young upstart John Lewis, who's almost synonymous with the far-reaching 1965 civil rights legislation passed by President Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, said, "The revolution is at hand, and we must free ourselves of the chains of political and economic slavery." Many Blacks empathize with this sentiment, such as Malcolm X, who in 1964, one year after John Lewis made that statement, declared that his followers would have to settle with either the ballot or the bullet, as white politicians would be coming into the community seeking their vote, but would not be advancing their interests. It follows then that many African Americans not only viewed class as second in importance to their issue of race, but many of these very same advocates ran on these issues and successfully entered public political office in the future, such as Representative John Lewis and the mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young. Many women in the past and modern era also advanced the advocacy and interests of their husbands, such as Coretta Scott King, who, like Eleanor Roosevelt, who advanced the legacy of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, spoke on behalf of her husband, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., after his death pertaining to the expansion of civil rights to human rights on the global stage. One of the greatest moral leaders of the modern era, the South African Nelson Mandela, sympathized with many of the socialist ideas of his communist comrades, even if he did not completely agree with them in practice. Nonetheless, these ideas were instrumental in bringing together rainbow coalitions throughout different periods of American history, especially under Black political leaders who were critical of an unequal economic and political system. Whether that was Fred Hampton, the leader of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, Harold Washington, the first Black mayor of Chicago, Reverend Jesse Jackson, a civil rights leader who ran for president in the 1980s, and of course, the first Black president of America, Barack Obama. There were also many Black political leaders who supported the rights of women, especially great intellectuals like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois. Although there are a variety of perspectives in this anthology, the purpose of presenting these ideas will be inherently to find some common ground in the future. However, the authors point out that the purpose of this book is not to assess social and political movements, but rather to present the theories that inform them. It is a credit to the authors that through this exhaustive anthology, they provide a glimpse into the tapestry that make up the legacy of Black struggle for liberation and why it is not part and parcel of the American experience. It is in fact synonymous with the aspirations of American democracy. It is essential to note that the majority of Black leaders who upset the status quo in their aspirations for seeking justice and liberty in compensation for years of bondage and betrayal throughout history faced harassment, exile, imprisonment, and death. To them, the authors dedicated their anthology. If you enjoyed this video podcast, please follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. These 6 episodes are in honor of Black History Month in February. In the description below are the titles for the upcoming 5 new episodes based off of the 5 sections reflecting the 5 periods of American history since 1768 up until 2008 with the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. These sections are based off of the book Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American Anthology. So, seeing as this is Black History Month, February, the 5-part podcast on Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American Anthology, there will be 5 future sections. The next podcast that I'll be delivering will be uploaded to YouTube and on my audio podcast channel, India Insight with Sunny Sharma, on Wednesday, February 12th, Lincoln's birthday. And this section is about the foundations of slavery and abolitionism, 1768 to 1861. There will be 4 sections coming after that, coming all the way to the present. So the coming up preview will be, as I said before, in honor of Abraham Lincoln's birthday, February 12th. Abraham Lincoln was a major proponent of political democracy. As I'll highlight in my next podcast, there were 3 periods of which there were 3 aspects of democracy that are being advocated for through the Project for Liberation. Abraham Lincoln, who was a major proponent of political democracy, this was achieved after the abolitionist period when the 3 Reconstruction amendments were found, primarily the 14th Amendment, which gave equal protection to all Americans. And in many cases, people say this was a refounding of America, just as a refounding of America occurred in 1965 with the passing of a very wide-ranging and wide-lasting, far-reaching civil rights legislation. There's also the project of social democracy that occurred in the 1930s and 40s, as led by such people as FDR. And there's the push for participatory democracy, which is led by such figures as Dr. King, as well as Malcolm X, as well as several other civil rights figures. So just as a preview for my next podcast, here are some of the figures I'll be mentioning in the next podcast. FDR, I will also be mentioning figures who I mentioned before, Phyllis Wheatley, abolitionists such as David Walker. As I said before, people who resisted slavery such as Nat Turner, other abolitionists such as Maria W. Stewart. I'll be talking briefly about the Amistad Revolt, which the Amistad was a 19th century Spanish ship carrying illegally kidnapped slaves, as well as the 3 people who were involved in that judicial case: 8th President Martin Van Buren, the 6th President John Quincy Adams, who represented those slaves and got them free, as well as mentioning how John Quincy Adams is really carrying forth the legacy of his father's John Adams, who also represented British soldiers during a judicial case, as well as several other abolitionists such as Sojourner Truth, Henry Highland Garnet, modern day figures such as Malcolm X, who carried forth the Black nationalism that was projected by past Black figures. I'll be also again mentioning the most prominent Black leader and abolitionist of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass. Lesser known figures who should be mentioned, such as Martin R. Delaney, who was as significant as Frederick Douglass. And also John S. Rock, who really coined the phrase "Black is beautiful," and really who projected the need for African Americans to use their own agency to form their own narrative. And I'll also be mentioning how Martin R. Delaney, who was one of the first Pan-Africanists and proponent of Black nationalism, and coined the phrase "Africa for Africans." And I'll also be mentioning how many people during the abolitionist period, as well as more forward in history, as well as in the modern era, understood that the Constitution needs to come alive in order for us to really have the aspirations for liberty and justice to apply to all people in the modern era. And there are many people who said this. Frederick Douglass said this. The Reverend James Lawson, who died last year, also said this. And And so the liberation struggle was deeply spiritual, which I'll also mention in the next podcast. It did have a religious bent, and many abolitionists were very spiritually motivated. But it wasn't just the Bible that was important; it was the Constitution that was also fundamental to carrying out the aspirations for liberty, not just for Black people, but for all people. As we see in the push for rights after the 1950s through the 1975s and onward. So I thank you for listening to this the first introduction, and I hope this will persuade you to watch my future podcast on Black History Month on the anthology Let Nobody Turn Us Around. So thank you for watching.